I want to start with your point about infrastructure and your point about we need to work hard to create jobs and ensure there is sufficient demand. How do we pay for that? And I'd like to remind you that you were a member of an administration that was very proud of its fiscal prudence and very proud of balancing budgets in the 90s. What should our approach be today?
You know, I think it's the essence of economic theories that the right economic theory depends on economic circumstances. And while gravitation is roughly constant, or at least is constant for billions of years, economic conditions change. And in the 1990s, it was a reasonable diagnosis in my country and in yours that substantial deficits and debts were leading to high capital costs, that those high capital costs were inhibiting private investment, that lack of private investment was slowing economic growth, and that slowdown in economic growth was in turn leading to larger deficits. And so you had a kind of vicious cycle of high interest rates, high deficits, slow growth, high deficits, high interest rates, slow growth, that retarded economic progress. And it was the great success of the Clinton-Rubin regime in the United States and the Credit-Martin regime in Canada to break those vicious cycles with very substantial economic benefit. But, and that was great. Today, though, no one can possibly believe that high capital costs are the dominant inhibition to investment. The 30-year interest rate in the United States is only a bit above 2% in a currency that we print ourselves. PE ratios, by some measures, are at extraordinary long-term average ratio relative to long-term average earnings, are at near record levels. Banks have hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of cash sitting on their balance sheets. And companies' indebtedness is at low levels. And so it can't be that solving that vicious cycle is the key to unlocking investment. The key to unlocking investment is having there be adequate demand. That's the key for businesses. And for public infrastructure, we can just look at the state of the infrastructure. Look at the set of bridges that do exist and the set of bridges that do not exist for transporting people between Canada and the United States, between Ontario and Michigan. You know, oil, shipping oil on trains, that is a 20th century technology, and it was not the last quarter of the 20th century that technology represents. And it is nuts, and it is dangerous. It is dangerous to the environment, and it is dangerous in the sense of accidents to be shipping so much oil on trains rather than in pipelines, yes, of which Keystone is a pipeline. And so the case, I'm proud of what we did in the 1990s, but it's a different world today, and it takes a different approach. Now, you say, will it pay for it? How will we pay for it? Here are some answers. First, it's not like by doing it, somehow we're taking on a big liability. Guess what? We are not going to allow Kennedy Airport to turn into a hulk that becomes completely dysfunctional in the United States. It will not happen. And so the question is, in what form are we going to pass a liability on to my children? Are we going to pass them paper debt that carries an average interest rate across all the U.S. debt of below 1%? Or are we going to pass them the accumulating cost of fixing Kennedy Airport and fixing the potholes in all the highways? And I would suggest that if I were them, I'd rather inherit the paper debt than inherit the deferred maintenance. That's point one. Point two, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. They're not like a bunch of touchy-feely, flaky guys. They're really not. They're not really known for being a bunch of freewheeling spenders. They're not. Not in some research paper, but in their flagship publication last fall, they said that if a typical industrialized country spent 1% more of GDP on infrastructure, that 6 years later, the ratio of its debt to its GDP would be, get this, 5% lower, not higher, because it would grow its economy, which would result in more tax revenues, would result in a larger ratio. So that's the second point. Third point, that'll be my last one, is there are ways to pay for it. I didn't have a chance to talk about it because I really wanted to focus on the middle class prosperity issues. But when somebody writes the history of this time 200 years from now, there's going to be a question about how global climate change is going to figure in that history. And I think there are actually two possibilities. One is we're going to get ourselves organized to save the world, in which case it's not going to figure very prominently. They're going to go, okay, the world's here. The world didn't melt. It's not going to really be that big a story. And the other is we're going to mess up. And right now it doesn't look that great, like we're not going to mess, like we really have the problem under control. It was really okay. Really, it was okay in my country, and I'll bet it was okay in your country. 9 months ago, when people in the United States paid $4 for gas. Today, they're paying $2.30 for gas. If we raised the taxes on gasoline, it would conserve energy. It would reduce congestion. It could pay for a ton of infrastructure, and people would still be paying less for gasoline than they were last summer. And so there is no reason why we cannot afford, with appropriate energy taxes, to pay for the infrastructure investment they need. In fact, I even saw a study that suggested that in Massachusetts, where I live, the consequences of bad infrastructure for the need for repairs of people's cars constituted a 15-cent a gallon tax. And so a bunch of the tax would pay for itself in terms of people needing to spend less money on their repairs. So economics may not have such a thing as a free lunch, but starting to engage in adequate or even positive net infrastructure investment for a growing economy has to be about as close as economics gets.